Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. And I'd like to begin by welcoming you all to the Tarjan Distinguished Lecture Series on behalf of our Center Director, Dr. Olivia Rayner, and our co-sponsors, the UCLA Center for Autism Research and Treatment and the UCLA Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Research Center. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. This lecture will be held from 11:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time with a 5 to 10 minute Q&A at the end of the hour. And if you have any questions for our speaker, feel free to send them through the Q&A link, which can be found on your Zoom toolbar. Also, you'll be provided with a link to complete the speaker evaluation at the end of the presentation, and we hope we'll take a few moments to complete that survey. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome our distinguished speaker, Dr. Rebecca Elias. By way of background, Dr. Elias is a postdoctoral scholar at the UCLA Summill Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior, where she works with Dr. Catherine Lord, one of the world's leading experts in autism. Now, Dr. Elias received her Ph.D. in clinical psychology from Virginia Tech, where she worked under the mentorship of Dr. Susan White. She completed her predoctoral internship at Indiana University School of Medicine. And prior to her graduate studies, Dr. Elias received her bachelor's degree in psychology from UC Berkeley. So Dr. Elias joined the Lord Lab at UCLA in 2019, where she manages a longitudinal study of child development and helps lead other ongoing projects. And Dr. Elias's research interests largely focus on understanding core processes associated with autism spectrum disorder across the lifespan and the influence these processes have on treatment response and adult clinical outcomes. Dr. Elias has participated as a researcher and a clinician on several NIH-funded clinical trials and has received independent funding through agencies such as the American Psychological Association. And she's a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders. So today, we're very fortunate to learn more about her research examining adult outcomes in autism. So with that, it's my sincere pleasure to welcome Dr. Rebecca Elias.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to talk with everyone today a little bit about the work on outcomes that we've been doing within our lab. So I'll spend a little bit of time today talking about individuals with autism as they grow up, and in this longitudinal study where the participants are now 30. So especially with this audience, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what autism spectrum disorder looks like in terms of the core behaviors of social communication and restricted and repetitive interests. Except to say that I think when we're talking about longitudinal trajectories and individuals with autism over time, and we talk about things like heterogeneity, it's not just that people with autism are different from one another, but really that autism changes over time in individuals as well. So someone who is autistic at 2 years old oftentimes looks very different in certain domains when they are 30. So we can kind of keep that in mind as we think about individuals maturing and growing over time and different experiences that they've encountered along the way. So in addition to these core features of autism, oftentimes we think about co-occurring disorders and conditions being something that goes along with the core features and phenotype of autism. And we think about things like depression and anxiety and other externalizing behaviors such as aggression, and then maybe medical features like sleep disturbance, seizures, GI dysfunction. So there's a whole host of features that kind of accompany these core phenotypic expressions of autism. And we can kind of think of these things as things that we want to measure over time because they can influence what someone looks like when they're an adult. So if you think about, and this isn't just true of autism, but all individuals as they age, you kind of think about growing up as you get older. And so here is, kind of a drawing or picture of maybe what I looked like as a redhead growing up. And there are lots of different opportunities that someone can experience over the lifespan. So you might think about educational opportunities or social opportunities or those co-occurring disorders that we just talked about. And the point that some of these opportunities hit can influence what we look like as an adult. And so I think it's important to kind of examine not just what are some of these opportunities, but when did some of these opportunities rise. So what's really unique about the work that I'm going to be talking about is it's a different way of looking at data. So when you think about data and research, you oftentimes think of cross-sectional and longitudinal designs. And in cross-sectional research, you might have a group of, let's say, 8-year-olds, and you might study this individual. And you might get this individual as well, and this one. And you can look at 8-year-olds all together and pick a certain domain, so maybe something like daily living skills. And we can study all of these 8-year-olds together and say, okay, daily living skills for typically developing youth at 8 years old look something like this. Or daily living skills for individuals on a spectrum might look like this around 8 years old. So what's a little bit different about what I'm going to be talking about today is rather than taking individuals who maybe are similar in age, what we're doing is we're looking at individuals, the same individual over time. So in this study in particular, we're going to be focusing on those folks who started and enrolled in the study at 2 years of age, who are now about 31. And so we're going to be, it's repeated measurement, so they were seen at multiple times throughout the study, same individuals, and I'll get to show you some of those videotapes today of what they actually look like across the lifespan. So the study that I'm going to be talking about today is a study that is spearheaded by Dr. Kathy Ward here at UCLA. And when we kind of think about the initial aims of this study, the first aims of the study were, first of all, can we diagnose autism in 2-year-olds? And what we found is that you can diagnose autism in individuals under 2, and that for the most part, these diagnoses are fairly stable across time. And so you can kind of see here from 2 to 3, from 3 to 5, 5 to 9, 9 to 19, and a lot of different combinations thereof. And then, you know, going along with that, they wanted to see, can we look at standardized measures of behavior, so things like the ADOS and the ADIR, and say, are these measurement tools reliable across raters, and are they related to clinical diagnoses of autism? And what we know now is that these tools are oftentimes referred to as the gold standard tools in autism assessment. And so these kind of 2 aims were established early on, not just by our team, but other work as well, for example, in the baby SIPS studies. So really what our lab has kind of been spending the most time examining going forward is this idea of trajectories and trajectories of development. And so what I mean by that is trying to see if we can map out what groups of people look like over time in different core domains. So for example, in verbal skills, what does someone look like from 2 to 30? Things like problem behaviors or adaptive behaviors. And then taking a look backwards and trying to say, is there anything early on that we can look at that may have predicted where someone lands at age 19 or 25 or 30? So this is where we've been spending the most amount of our time right now, and I'm going to be summarizing some of the studies that have come out of the lab recently, and then talk about some work which hasn't been published yet, specifically talking about diagnostic trajectories. So when we think about this idea of trajectories, I like to think about it as this idea of a pathway. So how do you get from point A to point B, and what are all of the things that happen in the middle? And so when we think about development in general, when we think about autism, when we think about access to opportunities and things like that, it's not a linear pathway. So there's lots of things that happen along the way. And our task has been to try to measure and see what that looks like over time and what type of opportunities and influences we've been able to experience. So the study is, again, the original aims of the study were, can we diagnose autism in 2-year-olds? And the study started off in North Carolina and in Chicago. And I'll go into detail in a little bit more of exactly what that looks like over time. But the neat thing about this study, which makes it a little bit different from other longitudinal studies, specifically in the US, is that we included many different measures, both parent reports and direct observations, so doing things like the ADOS, measuring parent-child interactions, getting parent reports, and now in adulthood, getting self-reports when we can. And it's a pretty diverse sample. So we have individuals from both rural and urban regions. We have individuals of different racial makeups, and we have different socioeconomic statuses within the sample as well. So it's fairly diverse in terms of location. So starting off here in North Carolina and Illinois, and then we added in some folks in Michigan, and also in terms of individual characterization. So this is a fairly, it's probably very small on your screen, and I'll do my best to kind of walk it through for you. So what you can see at the top here is that we have North Carolina and Chicago enrollment. So people first started in the study around age 2, and it was people who were referred for a comprehensive diagnostic assessment. And you can see on the left here are these people that were diagnosed with autism in these early assessments. And then over here on the right, we have these non-autistic developmentally delayed groups. So those with autism make up a much bigger number compared to those who were developmentally delayed. And what I want you to focus in on this slide the most is that they were seen at many different times. So we have them here at age 2, they were seen for a comprehensive diagnostic assessment, at age 3, at 5, at 9, in adolescence. So they were seen at 19 in person, and then young adulthood, they were seen at 25 and at 30. And then you can see here that these, what we call in the study as new recruits from Michigan, were enrolled around age 14 and then contributed to the study from there on after as well. So these kind of mark out when participants were seen for in-person face-to-face assessments. And what that kind of looks like is we have a team of research assistants and graduate students and postdocs who come to a family member's home. And so we pack our suitcases full of assessments and ADOS kits and IQ kits and go into that individual's home for the most part and conduct comprehensive assessments with the participant and family independently. And then in between some of these in-person face-to-face assessments, we've done telephone interviews and mailed out packets of self and parent report data for them to mail back. And in recent years, it's been about 2 times a year where they're giving back that data. So it's a lot of data that we're collecting, both face-to-face and through remote measures, especially now with telehealth. We're not going into their houses at this moment. So if you focus down here on the bottom in terms of these colored tiles, we've got 3 groupings that we oftentimes refer to when we're discussing these measures. So we have these folks in blue over here that are considered never ASD. And what I mean by that is these are the participants that were initially part of the developmentally delayed group and have never had autism over the course of the study. And then we break down these 2 groups, which is these autistic groups, into those with higher IQs and those with intellectual disability. you can see that there's a spread in terms of where all of these individuals have come. Okay, Christina, if you wouldn't mind pausing for a moment. So I should say that we have gotten permission from our participants to show some of these videos throughout our presentation today, but I'm going to have Christina sometimes pause our recording so that it doesn't get distributed over the web here. So this is a sketch of something that we created for our most recent grant application. And the purpose of this isn't so much to show some sophisticated model or something like that, statistics wise, but it's really just to kind of visually portray that, you know, when we're thinking about outcomes, outcomes come in many different shapes and sizes. So we might have things like objective outcomes, like where is a participant working? Where do they live? Do they live with parents? Do they live on their own? Do they live in supportive housing? And what do those daily skills look like? And then we might think about things like subjective outcomes like quality of life, satisfaction with life, agency, self-determination, so that motivation to do things. So these can oftentimes be different, yet both very important. And when we think about how does someone get to these places, not only are we thinking about what that participant looks like, so what is their IQ, what are their verbal abilities, what are their adaptive skills, but we're also really, need to be paying attention to things like family and relationship. What type of community resources are being used? What's their individual agency in terms of motivation and desire? So there's many different pathways. I think if you just kind of like take a step back and look at it and see all of these arrows, that there's many different ways of getting from point A to point B, kind of tracking with this idea from before. And then this here is a figure from Dr. Lord's paper that has recently been submitted. But again, it's just this idea that when we think about this study in particular and what has predicted later functioning later on, it's not just things at one finite point in development, but you can see that there's things at age 2, at age 3, at age 4, at age 5, 9, all predicting functioning later on, 18 and beyond. And actually, if we probably looked at it even more, you would see many, many more lines in between continuing on. So there's many things that contribute to outcomes, and we're going to be talking about some of those today in particular. So I think when we talk about this word outcome, oftentimes a discussion that comes up is what is a good outcome for someone on the autism spectrum? And the truth is that this idea of a good outcome really varies based on a variety of factors, namely, what article you're reading, what parent you're talking to, what autistic person you're talking to. It's a very individualized process. And if you look into what some of the research has said, so Pat Howland recently wrote this paper where she tries to define, what are outcomes across a wide variety of perspectives and influences. And you can kind of see in these red tiles that these are some things that have kind of come up over again and again in the literature of things like social outcomes. Some people have said, how do we categorize autism? Maybe that is indicative of a good outcome. Things like physical health, so things like obesity, or co-occurring things such as epilepsy or seizures, or sleep patterns. Things like quality of life, so how satisfied with life are you? Employment, where that person is working, and other things like autistic identity. And then other things have been floated around as factors which may influence some of these outcomes. So things such as mental health and co-occurring disorders and features. Things like gender, so females being a little bit different from males. So family and social influences, I think we touched on that a little bit earlier. And things like post-school support. So when that participant exits out of the school system, what types of supports are there to help foster them, obtain things like employment. So you can kind of see that there's many different things involved, and this is only one snapshot. So I think something that keeps coming up again and again is, how do we listen to autistic individuals and their families to tell us what makes something like a good outcome? So what we've done in our lab is try to think about different ways of defining outcomes to encompass many different things, so that we're not just focusing on, for example, employment being, what you think of when you think about good outcome, but many different ways of conceptualizing this idea. So one way of conceptualizing outcome that we have currently done in the LORD lab is really thinking about outcomes for two distinct groups. And when we think about these two distinct groups, oftentimes it's based for us on intellectual ability. And really what we're thinking about is those with greater cognitive abilities and those with intellectual disability. So we'll focus first on those with more cognitive abilities, and then we'll go into focus on those with intellectual disability. And Christina, if you wouldn't mind pausing the recording. Okay, so going back to this idea of what is a good outcome for someone with autism, I'll just quickly highlight some of the work that Jamie Macaulay has done within the lab here. And so one way that he has thought about what are good outcomes for a variety of different individuals with autism is this idea of breaking down domains into friends, work, and living. And basically, what he did in this study is, if you can kind of pay attention to these green tiles, is take individuals who had one or more friends, had an independent regular job, and were living independently, and total up the amount of people that were engaged in these tasks. So you can kind of see here in terms of these tiles, the number of people that had 3 of those outcomes met, 2, 1, and then 0. And it's a pretty big split there in terms of the number of outcomes that was met. So if you can kind of hold this in your brain for a few minutes, because we're going to be coming back to talking about this a little bit later on when we talk about diagnoses. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about those with intellectual disability and with a little less cognitive skills than those seen previously. So Christina, if you wouldn't mind pausing, start the recording again. So if you think about these videos, I think it does a really nice job of showing, what someone looks like as they grow up. And for different people, it looks very differently. And also for that same person, they look differently at different points in development. So again, going back to this idea of what is a good outcome. So Jamie Macaulay here again conceptualized it, but this time for individuals with intellectual disabilities, friends, having something to do, and independence and self-care. And so here it is having like friends, peers, or acquaintances, supported or non-supported employment, and then daily living skills above an 8-year-old level or below an 8-year-old level. And just as before, you can kind of see it in terms of those added up and aggregated, what it looks like for the sample over time. So again, just bank this information for a few slides. So I'm going to be talking a little bit going forward about a different way of measuring trajectories. And here looking at trajectories specifically of the core features of ASD. So we're thinking about social communication and restricted and repetitive behaviors, and looking at those over time and how those match or don't match with diagnostic impressions of blinded clinicians. So if you look here in terms of the assessments that were done face-to-face in person, we have participants that were seen between 2 and 25 that I'm going to be talking about today. And in adulthood between 19 and 25 in their most recent assessment, clinicians did comprehensive diagnostic assessments using all of the gold standard measures And after aggregating all of the information from the gold standard measures, assigning diagnostic impressions, so whether they thought that individual had autism or didn't. So the individuals that were sort of in the field collecting data made impressions and then came back to the lab, watched videos with senior clinicians and researchers, including Dr. Lord, and then making a best consensus diagnosis based on all of the information that was gathered. And so taking those diagnostic impressions is another way that we can categorize individuals in addition to things like IQ, employment, things like that. And so as part of those assessments, we're going to be talking a lot today about the ADAS and about the Vineland. So I guess what was interesting about collecting this data on these diagnostic assessments is that we know out of these 155 individuals that were seen in adulthood, some kids move out of the spectrum based on those blinded diagnoses, and then some people move into the spectrum. And this is really different from doing a DSM-5 evaluation because we're not doing things like by history and sort of having it be something that carries with them forever. But when you have someone that is doing a comprehensive assessment, there are some kids that emerge and adults that emerge a little bit different. If you look at the red here, I think what's interesting is that for those that moved into the spectrum, everyone, so this is across more able and less able, so those with and without intellectual disability, moving in, those people were first identified beginning in adulthood. And what you can see is some of those people that moved out, there is a substantial proportion that moved out beginning in adulthood, but also some that were identified a little bit earlier on. And if you kind of look at the breakdown in terms of numbers here, for those who are more cognitively able, we have a group of 69 individuals that were seen in adulthood. And you can see that the majority kept their diagnosis of autism. Then the next biggest group are those that never had a diagnosis of autism that were developmentally delayed at 2 years of age. And then you see these two groups here of people that have lost their diagnosis and those that have gained their diagnosis. And what this slide shows is what people looked like over time. So what you can see, and I'm not sure if you're seeing my computer bar down here or the bottom axis, but I'll try to do my best to explain to you what is going on here. So, you know, a couple of groups to keep in mind and look towards is what we see is this is the total score here. And when we're thinking about ADASs, we're thinking about scores 4 and above being oftentimes the clinical threshold. And if you look at those blue and green lines here, so those that always had autism remained fairly stable across the lifespan. And what we see is that those that lost diagnosis had a very steady and stable improvement over time. And you see the same thing with that yellow line of those that gained a diagnosis. It's a very steady and slow worsening over time. And so for those two groups in particular, what we see is that for those that always had autism and those that lost a diagnosis, although some are still picked up in adulthood and are being identified for the first time in adulthood, what we see is beginning around age 5, the gap begins to widen. And it becomes statistically significant for those who always had a diagnosis of autism and those that are in this other group here. And then for those that gained a diagnosis, it doesn't become statistically significant until adulthood here at 19. And then if we go ahead and we look at adaptive skills here, so here is the Vineland ABC scores. And I apologize, I just realized that the axis here on the bottom is centered. So if you can mentally just add 2 to every number. What you see here as well, if you just go ahead and look at the lines here, is that for most people there's a gradual improvement in terms of adaptive skills over time, and especially so for those that have lost the diagnosis, and a worsening in adaptive skills for those that have gained a diagnosis. And then if you kind of briefly look over what some of these objective outcomes might be, so things like driving, living on your own, having a paid job, or still being in post-secondary education, you can see that people are driving in every single group, at different rates, and the same with all of these different categories. So we're not seeing one group emerge as, only having people that are driving, living on their own, having a paid job. It's prevalent across all the groups, more so in the lost diagnosis group than the others. And I think what's really interesting is in our sample in particular, it's not a group of people that have had a lot of one-to-one structured teaching before 3 years of age. So really, when you break it down, the lost diagnosis group does have statistically more intervention, but if you actually look at it, they received on average 45 minutes of structured teaching per week. Okay, so we're thinking about interventions here back in the 1990s. And then those that retain a diagnosis, that always had a diagnosis of autism, so their weekly average was less than 10 minutes of structured teaching per week. So this is really different than some of the other published research showing that early in development, people that were receiving, 40 plus hours of ABA had different outcomes. And then if you go back to this idea of these tiles of how are these groups doing based on independent living, employment, and friendships, it is statistically different by diagnostic category. But again, if you kind of look at it, people in each diagnosis group have achieved at least 2 of the 3 variables. So all of that lost diagnosis group, but then a fair percentage of those in the gained, never had, and retained diagnosis. And then if we go ahead and look at those who had intellectual disability, so the number is greater here. We have about 86 people compared to 69 earlier on. And you see a similar pattern. So most of the people have kept their autism diagnosis. Some that never had a diagnosis continue to have. And then a very even smaller group here of those that have lost a diagnosis and gained a diagnosis within this intellectually disabled group. So if you go ahead and if you look at their trajectories, what you're seeing here is a little bit less clear of a picture than earlier on with those without intellectual disability. And really what we found is that those that lost a diagnosis and gained a diagnosis, there's a pretty big effect of IQ. So those that lost a diagnosis and gained a diagnosis had significantly lower IQs than other individuals in the sample. And what that really tells us is that in adulthood, when you have individuals with profound intellectual disability, with or without autism, it becomes harder for clinicians to really tease those 2 things apart. So in terms of clinical decision making, we have a harder time, and again, it's very small groups, only 4 people, and 4 people were identified in both of those changing diagnostic groups. It becomes a little bit harder for clinicians to make those diagnostic decisions because it looks pretty similar. So kind of taking all of this together, there's a small subset of individuals who either no longer behaviorally manifest clinical symptoms of autism, specifically on the ADOS, and looking at adaptive skills on the Vineland, and another small subset of individuals who do sort of gain that symptom profile later on in adulthood. And the bottom line is that there are many factors that could be contributing to this in adulthood and the presentation of what individuals are presenting like. So I kind of, in reflecting about what we've talked about today, I think the biggest take-home point is that there are many ways of conceptualizing outcomes in autism. And that really, when we think about those objectives, so things like where they're working, where they're living, do they have friends, and then subjective outcomes. So I haven't talked about it in this study, but we're looking at things like quality of life in other studies. Dr. Macaulay has also come up with something like a happiness factor in Dr. Lord in some recently published research. What we're finding is that those 2 outcomes are not the same. And really what we need to be thinking about is how do we creatively define outcomes in the future to capture the range of presentations in autism. And longitudinal studies in particular give us a really unique opportunity to identify the precise point where individuals may be improving, or maybe gaining skills, or maybe gaining a greater quality of life. Or on the flip side, maybe also gaining a co-occurring condition, or struggling a little bit more with obtaining employment and things like that. So longitudinal study, and this study in particular, has some nice abilities to look at change over time. So the take-home message, autism is so heterogeneous, and if I can't impart it enough, it's not just heterogeneous in that one individual with autism looks like one individual with autism, but someone with autism looks very different across the lifespan. And we need to continually assess and monitor to see what types of changes are being made over time. And there's still just a ton that we don't know yet. So I want to thank the Lord Lab, and you can see us here pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, where we're working remotely, and the study is being supported by the NIH. And the biggest thank you goes to the participants and families who've been participating in this research for almost 30 years now. I'd be happy to go over some questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Elias, for that, really important overview of this longitudinal study of autism. This is really the only one of its kind, so we're very, very grateful to you for sharing your outcomes. Based on your research, what advice would you give to parents of young children newly diagnosed with autism to improve outcomes for the future?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think it's a question that every parent has, is like, well, what will my child's future look like? And I think that is a difficult one to answer, because as you can see, I think through some of the videos here, that there's a lot of change over time. And so what types of things that can be done, to foster those strengths that you see within a child over the lifespan, I think makes a big difference for families. I think that continuing to monitor and see the changes that are being made, and to celebrate some of those differences over the lifespan as an individual has access to more opportunities and things like that. So it's a very dynamic condition where there is lots of changes over time, and it's hard to say at point A what a child is going to look like at point B, because there's different things that predict outcomes at different ages. So for example, at 2, we're looking at different things than we are at 3, 5, 9, 19, and so on.
All right, well, thank you for that. I want to encourage our attendees to feel free to send any questions that they have for Dr. Elias in the Q&A tab on the Zoom toolbar. We did get a question from Alan Sandler. He wants to know, did you gather any data regarding medication management influencing the developmental trajectory?
Yeah, so we do have a lot of data on medication and on physical health outcomes in participants as well. And Catherine Byrne, a grad student in the lab, recently submitted a paper discussing some of those health outcomes and medications trajectories as well. And so we didn't look at it in relation to some of the studies that were talked about in this presentation, but we do see some differences with the types of medications that were taken. We know that in our sample in particular, there are a lot of psychiatric medications that are being given over the lifespan, particularly in adulthood, in addition to other health conditions as well. So keep a lookout for her paper, where she talks a little bit about obesity, seizure use, and medication use in our sample.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned very briefly there at the end that you've been conducting some research on happiness and quality of life, and just wondering if you can give us an overview of some of your happiness and quality of life longitudinal outcomes.
Yeah, so we tried to, in particular for some of the studies that I described here, measure quality of life, both from parents' perspective of how they think their child, what their quality of life might be, and in particularly relying on parent report for individuals with intellectual disability, but also getting that self-report from participants that are able to report for themselves as well. And it's tricky because in our sample, we're trying to get as much data as we can. And so some of that data is a little bit preliminary in terms of how it relates to some of the diagnostic groupings that I was talking about before, except that when we ran some of these preliminary analyses, we found that individuals with all diagnoses were reporting very high quality of life metrics in our sample in particular. Another way of us thinking about, this, I guess, happiness factor is Jamie McCauley and Dr. Lord. It was published in 2020, so I encourage you to check it out. Aggregated sort of quality of life, but also things like positive affect, happiness, and alternatively other things like depression and parental burden and things like that, and developed, what might be some of those things into like a happiness factor. And we're finding that individuals across the whole lifespan, do at different varying degrees and related to different things and trajectories over the lifespan, both autism and without, experience good quality of life and well-being. And so I encourage you to check out a little bit of their work. I believe it was published in Autism that describe some of those ideas as well.
Thank you, Dr. Elias. Again, welcoming our attendees. If you want to send any final questions to Dr. Elias in the Q&A, which is located on the toolbar of your Zoom link here. So another question relates to mental health trajectories and what you found there. If you could kind of give a little overview about outcomes in relation to things like depression and anxiety, other mental health conditions.
Yeah, so our sample in particular is a little bit different from some of the other research that's been reported out there that report really high rates of co-occurring disorders. And so we have tracked a variety of co-occurring disorders over time, and the rates are a little bit lower than what you might see in some of the other literature, particularly with depression and anxiety. But we recently published about a year ago in Development and Psychopathology, looking at trajectories of things like attention, hyperactivity, and anxiety, and I believed some depressive symptoms over time. And we found something unique happening in adolescence and beyond. But again, I think what's a little bit different about this sample from a lot of the other research that we're reading about in the literature is it has a little bit less co-occurring symptomology than what we know about some of the other research that is out there.
Okay, thank you. One of the things I think that's so impressive about this longitudinal study is the retention rates that you've managed to keep with your study participants. Any predictors of who dropped out of the longitudinal study, and any thoughts about why that may have happened?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we have greater attrition among participants that were Black and had lower socioeconomic status. And so that's really quite a shame. And so what we've done in our analyses is we've tried to include attrition and reasons for attrition. So for example, race and education level to account for that. But it's quite unfortunate that those individuals dropped out at a greater proportion than the rest of the sample.
Yes, definitely. I guess maybe one final question comes from Yasmin Balarian, Dr. Balarian from UC Riverside. She says, wonderful presentation. Do you have any data on post-secondary rates from this longitudinal sample that you can share?
Yeah, so we haven't published too much on the post-secondary rates of this sample. We do know a little bit more about employment and post-secondary. So Elaine Clark, a graduate student in the lab right now, is working a little bit to try to describe the amount of time that people spent in school when they graduated high school, and then a little bit about their employment trajectories. So what we do know about this sample in particular is it's a greater proportion of individuals with intellectual disability than without. And then those without intellectual disability, we have many individuals that have attended post-secondary schooling. However, it's TBD in terms of their trajectories and then early predictors that could account for post-secondary completion.
Thank you. We just got another quick question in the Q&A about what incentives you use to help retain participants.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's taxing and it's exhausting to have these examiners come into your home for 3 hours, every 2 years. So what we try to do is there's a small financial incentive through a gift card to participants, but we try to accommodate as best as we can. So we'll order food, we send a holiday card with, I think last year it was a UCLA mug. And really, it's not, I think the incentives are so small that that's not the reason that they're participating. So I think it's really a testament to these families that keep coming back year after year and participate in this study, because what I hear from families anecdotally is that they like contributing to research. And we try to send out a newsletter kind of summarizing the type of research that we've done with these participants. But having that data of these videos of participants over time is pretty invaluable. So I'm very honored to be a part of the study and to have these parents and participants that keep coming back.
Yeah, really impressive retention rates. I think it speaks a lot to the rapport that your research team has developed with these families. I guess to just kind of wrap things up, are there any factors that you'd like to examine in the future? What are your future hopes for this longitudinal study?
Yeah, so we just submitted a renewal of our grant. So hopefully we have many more years of funding to continue this research, and that's spearheaded by Dr. Lord. But we're really interested in this next phase of looking at things like motivation and agency and what types of interests that people have and how that motivates success in different areas. So we're very interested in continuing to develop trajectories, but to also look at some of these more internal factors which may drive different pathways for different individuals.
Well, very exciting. We hope that you get renewed. We will keep our fingers crossed and look forward to hearing more about these really important outcomes coming out of the Lord Lab. But just want to thank you again, Dr. Elias, for sharing this very important research with our group. Want to thank all the attendees for joining us, and we hope that you'll visit the link in the chat to complete a brief evaluation. If you'd like to share this lecture with others, it will be posted live to tape on our Tarjan Center website. But in the meantime, once again, thank you so much to Dr. Elias and to the Lord Lab for sharing your important research. And we wish everyone a wonderful day.